and say what a pleasure to welcome both the Honorable Kevin Rudd and Achim Steiner, both who really don't need introduction to this amazing gathering. Let me say to our panelists that we have a number of our permanent missions, some of our ambassadors, distinguished colleagues from both the Asia Society and from UNDP, as well as the broader UN system, joining this this conversation. And my name is Kanni Wignaraja. I'm UNDP's regional director and the ASG for Asia and the Pacific. And I will be lightly moderating this session. So today, as you've seen from the flyer, we will be discussing the breadth and the staying power of this Asian century and unpack some of the exciting topics, some of the cracks and the chaos that is of strategic importance, both to our region, but with obvious implications for the world at large. So just maybe a couple of facts to set the tone before I hand over to Kevin for his opening remarks. It is interesting that in 1950, the share of the Asia-Pacific countries in global output had fallen to actually less than 20% of the total. But gradually, over the last few decades, we've seen the economic center of gravity move eastward, and the region now accounts for close to half of the world's output. And this spectacular rise is what's sometimes referred to as the Asian century, and giving prominence to the world's two most populous countries, China and India, but also other Asian countries that have populations over 100 million, but also dozens of smaller ones that have seen amazing progress in the recent past. So we are very much looking forward to unpacking some of this, but also the lessons, the more recent lessons of what COVID, climate change, crises have done to put a dent or even a big crack in this. And how might this change the course of the 21st century and Asia's place in this? So we have two exceptional leaders with whom to have this conversation: the Honorable Kevin Rudd, President of the Asia Society, former Prime Minister of Australia. And as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mr. Rudd has been absolutely an active personality in both the global and regional thought leadership and policy for decades. And he's also considered a leading international scholar on China. And many of you would have already heard Mr. Rudd as a regular contributor also on the in global media on international relations, climate change, and the political economy of the region. Achim, our UNDP Administrator, also a leading international expert on global environment and climate change, development economist, and prior to this, Executive Director also of UNEP, the Director General of IUCN, and the Director of the Oxford Martin School at Oxford University. I would like to recognize already the presence of some of our ambassadors who've started joining us. If you could please, Excellencies, identify in your Zoom link as the PR of your country, and we can put you on the panel. All of our UNDP resident representatives are on, some of our UN resident coordinators, and welcome also to all the colleagues from Asia Society and the public. So this is going to be approximately 60 minutes. It will be recorded for those who weren't able to join us today. And we're going to start with some opening remarks from our two panelists. And then I will take 3 questions from our UNDP reps in the region, and then open it up to all of you. So please raise your hand in the Zoom hand raise function, and then we will know you want to ask a question. So without further ado, let me please invite Mr. Rudd to deliver his opening remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Kanni, and it's good to be here with Achim in this important panel talking to our UNDP family across Asia and the Pacific. And if I could simply begin by expressing my continued personal support for the work which UNDP does across the world. I know enough about the UN system to know how underappreciated the work done in countries and on the ground often is by governments around the world. But there are some of us still who understand how important this work is. So for those reasons, I'd simply like to extend my thanks to each and every one of you.
If please we could mute until you have a question. Thank you. Sorry, back to you, Kevin.
That's good. To all of you in the UNDP family, thank you for your work, and I'd like in that context to acknowledge the excellent leadership from Achim, leading what is a critical institution across the UN family as well, and particularly in these years of extraordinary budget challenge and geopolitical challenge. So I've been asked to reflect on the shape of our wider region over the decade ahead. So let me, in 5 or 10 minutes, simply sketch out as I see the region unfolding. And then in our Q&A and our dialogue with Achim, go to the questions of what UN agencies can do given the changing configuration of the region over that period. I think number one, pure geopolitics. You don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar, Achim, you don't even have to be an Oxford Scholar in order to work out that we are in a profound period of geopolitical change, and that the fulcrum of that is in East Asia and the West Pacific. The essential dynamic of it is the changing balance of power between China and the United States. We see this unfolding militarily, we see it unfolding economically, and we see it also developing technologically. And in all three of those domains, there are debates, but frankly, increasingly clear outcomes in terms of this convergence in the balance of power between the two countries. The general consensus is that sometime by the end of the 2020s, we see the Chinese economy emerge as a larger economy than the United States, of course, as GDP measured by market exchange rates. Militarily, I think most of the militaries within the region who analyze these things closely would say that right now, China and the United States within the theater have achieved a level of strategic parity in conventional terms. Globally, that's not the case, where the American military, of course, remains dominant. But in terms of Indo-Pacific Command and the assets available to the Chinese PLA within theater, there is a high degree of parity. And then thirdly, on the technology front, there is an open question as to whether the gap between the two countries will be progressively narrowed. China hopes and believes that it will through its new national accelerated strategy to develop its high technology industry sector, first in the China 2025 strategy, but also that which has replaced it in the 14th five-year plan. Whereas America, still with enormous powerhouses of innovation out of Silicon Valley and major companies like Intel, but also companies such as TSMC and Samsung, located in countries which are fundamentally allied to the United States or supported by the United States, still controlling within its hands the future of the global semiconductor microchip industry, which is so fundamental to the future of the artificial intelligence revolution. So why do I spend some time simply going through these dynamics? Because the truth is the changing posture and policy both of China and in response to it, the United States, is driven by these fundamental changes in the balance of power between them. China under Xi Jinping has become demonstrably more assertive of its national interests as it perceives them and its foreign policy interests than was the case prior to Xi Jinping's leadership and, frankly, since the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And of course, since the election of the Biden administration, we have seen a continuation of the Trump administration's strategic framework of one of strategic competition with the People's Republic of China and the abandonment of the previous framework of what was called strategic engagement. This will become more acute as the decade progresses, which means the available terrain for independent and multilateral institutions such as the United Nations and within that UNDP will become more problematic rather than less, but still not impossible terrain to navigate effectively if these institutions are cleverly run. I think the second point I'd like to emphasize as far as the shape of the region is concerned for the decade ahead goes to pure economics. Although there's no such thing as pure economics, it's always political economy, most particularly in East Asia and the West Pacific. But in terms of the megatrends across our part of the world, I think it would be wrong to ignore two fundamental factors. Xi Jinping uses this term, the gravitational pull of the Chinese economy. And given its sheer scale, and given the fact that China is now the dominant trade partner of virtually every country in Asia, prospectively becoming one of the most significant investment partners of each country in Southeast Asia, and with the emergence of a Chinese digital commerce world increasingly underpinned not just by Chinese software and digital commerce systems and standards, but also by the emergence of a digital RMB as well. So we will have that continuing gravitational pull on the part of the Chinese economy. At the same time, we're going to see the binary dimensions of the US-China geopolitical divide reflected in a level of economic decoupling impact profoundly on pan-regional supply chains, as well as concentrated within the technology sector. If there is a third factor at play across the region's economies, it's this. It is the rising tide of protectionism. You folk, good folk at the UNDP understand that. You saw the death of the Trans-Pacific Partnership as the first act of the Trump administration. All of us understand the difficulty of the politics of negotiating the passage through the Congress of a new American commitment to the TPP. In the meantime, China has indicated its desire to join the existing TPP, having already joined in the initial manifestation or articulation of RCEP as a regional free trade agreement. And so these dynamics affecting the pan-regional economy are at play. The gravitational pull of the Chinese economy, at the same time, the bifurcation of the region into perhaps competing supply chains, driven by degrees of economic decoupling, particularly in technology, but not limited to technology, plus this surrounding climate of protectionism. And so this is therefore a challenging economic environment as well. One footnote to the above is as follows. We often assume that the Chinese growth model is inexorable, that it is a juggernaut, that it will simply continue to expand. That may well be the case, but there are changes in China's domestic economic model which should also cause us to reflect on the sustainability of China's growth in and around its current target of 6%, and whether in fact some of the changes in China's domestic policy settings, particularly in relation to the private sector and its impact on private fixed capital investment and private sector business confidence, will in fact see that growth rate fall further. Third point, and I'll conclude on this, Achim, is simply on climate change, something near and dear to your heart and to my heart. and the work that we've both sought to do with some success and many failures in the past. The one bright note across the region in terms of climate change action lies in the emerging consensus across much, but not all, of the Asia-Pacific region on mid-century carbon neutrality. Already the commitments from China by 2060, the United States by 2050, Japan and the ROK by 2050, and other economies, of course, our European friends by 2050. And the most recent discussions between Xie Zhenhua, the Chinese negotiator, and John Kerry in Shanghai produced, given the geopolitics surrounding it, a reasonably positive outcome. My prediction, based on work we've done through the Asia Society as convening high-level 1.5-track dialogues between the Chinese and the Americans over the last 12 months prior to the election of the Biden administration on climate, indicates that there is, on balance, much more cause for optimism than not, that these two countries will continue to act, and I believe increasingly decisively, on climate change, not because they're in love with each other, but because their fundamental national, economic, and environmental interests now dictate that. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you so much, Kevin, and I think you've teed it up very much along some key lines that I'm sure Achim will also be reflecting on, including his own comments. So Achim, over to you.
Thank you, Kanni, and Kevin, thank you for, as always, having this extraordinary ability to take complexity and vast sets of issues and condense them into a series of very poignant, I think, reference points in thinking about what happens next. And I will not try to emulate it. Let me add to it, perhaps, with a perspective of a set of development choices, because as head of the United Nations Development Program, clearly in that notion of the future of development, the development pathways, the choices that countries in Asia will pursue and choose to follow, much of what you have just described will also be influenced by these choices. And I think the first thing that anyone who looks at Asia today obviously realizes, and I think it bears repeating, is that from a pure quantitative perspective, what happens in Asia matters to the rest of the world. With 4.5+ billion people now, more than half the world's population lives in Asia. And we know that whether it is in terms of its consumption, production, in terms of the societal models, the development models that it pursues, these have consequences, not just in climate change. I mean, the whole world trade reality, I think, of the last 3 decades, China's emergence as really the factory of the whole world. These are, I think, just illustrations of a much more profound influence that Asia has.
Yes.
Renate, you're on live, please. Thanks. And I think it is critical that we look at how technology, but also beyond technology, things have begun to already gravitate towards Asia. I'm often struck when you think back of the last 30 years, the automotive industry. The United States, 60s, 70s was the pioneer, clearly the front line of technology for mobility. It then shifted to Europe, really, if you take the 80s, the 90s, the dominance of European car manufacturers. Then Japan emerged, and then China, as really economies that were able to build on technology platforms, but also develop mass market approaches, new ways of entering a global marketplace. And yet, interesting enough, things don't necessarily stay there. And I think that speaks to your point about strategic engagement and how technology might still offer us very surprising developments. If you look at just automotive technology, in the last 5 years, the frontier of innovation has moved back to the west coast of the United States, while China continues to intensify and solidify its mass production base. But there are other aspects also, and I think they speak to, first of all, the ability of Asia to reflect on its own development futures. It's, I think, not coincidental that in many parts of Asia, in many countries, the debate about development is in some ways broader, more philosophical than perhaps we are used to from a North American paradigm or even a European one. It's not coincidence that notions such as self-sufficiency, gross national happiness, the ecological civilization discussions in China are emerging out of an Asian experience of rapid economic development, but also recognizing the tensions that have come with it, whether on the social front, inequality inevitably has risen enormously in many Asian countries. It's beginning to tear on the fabric of otherwise national cohesion. Sustainability challenges certainly have become very prominent, not just in the cities of Asia, but really in polluted watercourses, depletion of ecological infrastructure. I think these are now really beginning to shape a way of thinking about development that will radiate well beyond China, India, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, just to mention a few countries. So I think that sheer relevance of what happens in Asia goes far beyond trade flows and the economics in a narrow sense. Now, the political economy clearly has become a much more complicated scenario in which to operate, and you have spoken to it very clearly. I think where I see opportunities for us is, first of all, Asian countries themselves have become far more outward looking. That may not be something that everybody shares, but there was a degree to which China certainly was very much focused on itself. India, the two major economies in terms of people and economic size, having become far more linked to a global economy of innovation, of technology, of trade, but also of ideas. And I think this is going to be an interesting play of forces. How much does that mutual interaction really create a more aligned set of development pathways? And here I think technology has been extremely interesting. The emergence of digital technologies, artificial intelligence, has been, unlike other technological innovations, far more synchronized in the way that it has been deployable virtually everywhere, almost at the same time. And it is perhaps striking that in India, the government has decided to invest heavily in digital infrastructure as a foundational platform for development, including Prime Minister Modi's announcement to connect 450,000 villages with fiber optic connectivity as a result of what was happening with COVID. The Aadhaar scheme, this remarkable registration platform that has been introduced in India, Alibaba and financial. We always talk about Amazon, about Google, but there are equivalents emerging. And even in an African continent, which often is viewed as a laggard on technology, digital finance has become, in some countries already, a frontier in global innovation terms. So I think for development, there are extraordinary opportunities opening up. And perhaps the greatest Achilles heel right now is to create within societies a sense of shared purpose and a shared understanding of what matters. And I think Asia will teach us a lot in the years to come about how to resolve these differences. Competition, inequality, whether it is based on class or on religion or on ethnicity, are just as existent in Asia as in any other part of the world. But there are lessons, I think, for many of us to learn who work in development as to how countries are approaching these points of tension. And therein lies perhaps one way in which to understand that development thinking as it is evolving in Asia will radiate well beyond, let's say, the immediacy of just the economic, technology, and perhaps geopolitical dimension. For us in UNDP, I think this offers us an enormous set of possibilities to be a connector. I think UNDP, the development program of the United Nations in the 21st century, is not a development aid organization anymore. This is not about importing either technology, funding, or ideas from outside. It is to accompany governments at their very different stages in their very immediate context in which they have very difficult choices to make, with both best practice, with building capacity, with developing the institutional infrastructure, but also, for instance, the social protection infrastructure. We have learned so much in these last 14 months of COVID that has been revealing, shocking, and to some extent quite frightening in how vulnerable our societies are. Asia, not different from any other part of the world. How are we able to construct the kind of society, economy, and what is the role of the state also, and of government and of governance in this drama that is playing out at ever more accelerating pace, which is really the challenge of transformation and development choices right now that things that used to have a period of maybe 5 or 10 years to land, sometimes now land literally overnight in the reality of an existing development context. I think our role as multilateral organizations, as the United Nations, is to provide both that partnership to countries that enables them to have access to the best possible ideas, best practices, at the same time to help them invest in their national development infrastructure in ways that is, yes, also taking advantage of international capital, be it concessional, be it development aid, but also private investment. But most of all, to find a way in which regulatory frameworks create an economy within which private sector investment becomes part of building societies rather than simply extracting from them. This tension between public and private sector, public budgets and private capital, I think is increasingly going to define options and choices, because it is quite evident if we want to tackle an issue such as climate change or poverty reduction, we are talking about trillions of dollars of investment. And that is in no country available through taxation and public budgets. Finding a way in which financial markets, domestic financial markets, are also able to invest in these development approaches is going to be fundamental. And this is another area that matters. I end by just perhaps taking one step back and also saying, from the perspective of Asia to the rest of the world, why should we not take this attitude and approach that, well, many countries in Asia are now wealthy enough in per capita GDP terms, there is no more need for international or development cooperation. Well, first of all, as we all know, Asia is a very diverse continent. You have China and India, you have Malaysia and Indonesia, but you also have Afghanistan and Myanmar, you have Pakistan and Bangladesh, you have Bhutan and Sri Lanka. These are not all more or less identical settings. They're very diverse. They require very different partnerships and also are at very different stages of their own development. But if the world allows the larger geopolitical tension to define its terms of engagement purely in those terms, then we may end up with more situations like Afghanistan. And I just looked up this morning again, what did it cost the United States alone to engage with Afghanistan? And I use that term deliberately in a neutral sense, just in this last 10 years of, let's say, the years 2007 to 2017, which is where I found the number. Just the United States spent $2.4 trillion in dealing essentially with a conflict crisis country, one country. That's the price of not being wise enough to invest, to be a proactive partner in helping and supporting and partnering with countries in Asia in moving forward the development trajectory to where the contradictions of 20th century development thinking, which basically had a sort of chronology, first economy, then we'll deal with social and inequality, and then we'll sort out the sustainability, environmental problems at the end. That paradigm is gone. The future of development requires something much more sophisticated. And I think it was no accident that in 2015, the General Assembly, despite all the differences, managed to agree on the 2030 agenda, 17 sustainable development goals, which I often describe as really, in its inverse logic, the 17 great risks to our common future, individually as much as collectively, that if we don't address them together, we will actually not be able to sort them out. And that is why I think we are at such an interesting point in time where many question multilateralism and the idea of the United Nations. I would argue the opposite is true, but, and that is also a fact, the way that countries view the UN, the way that the United Nations has not evolved rapidly enough, in part explains why the perception factor is often more characterized by doubt than by a vision about the future. Back to you, Kanni.
Thank you very much, Achim. And I want to recognize that we have our ambassadors from Sri Lanka, from Fiji, Iran, Nauru, Tuvalu, Brunei, Vanuatu, who have joined us. I'm going to open up for a few comments, questions to Kevin Rudd, first from Beate, our resident representative in China. Beate, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kanni. Pleasure to join you all, and thank you, Achim and Mr. Rudd, for this extremely insightful remarks. I actually have a question for Mr. Rudd, because you spoke quite a bit about the dynamics, complexities, and divides in the US-China relationship. And I think one thing that we're seeing is that there is a risk that this could actually influence or curtail the space that multilateral actors have in engaging with China on its international cooperation initiatives. And at the same time, of course, the volume, increasing volume in financing, development financing that China is putting forward has the potential to not only fill development gaps, but also accelerate action on the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement, if aligned with sustainability principles and international best practices and norms. So my question to you is, what would be your advice to multilateral actors how to engage in this very important space? Thank you.
Over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, there are challenges which continue to be underpinned by the geopolitical factors I referred to before. But let me utter a heretical view, which is this creates, in fact, new opportunities, fresh opportunities for entrepreneurial leadership of multilateral institutions within our region, most particularly those associated with the United Nations family. You see, as bilateral mechanisms become more fragmented, the opportunity, therefore, for multilateral institutions to fill the void actually rises. But this will not occur if multilateral institutional leadership is passive. It means actively walking into spaces which, in fact, are being vacated. As you know, nature abhors a vacuum. So that's my first overall point. The second is this. Look, it's quite plain that there has emerged different views of development models around the world. Now, the China development model, which has been strongly advocated by Xi Jinping in the period since the 19th Party Congress, is quite plain. And China speaks with increasing confidence about the applicability of that model around the world. And China also has made quite plain through the Belt and Road Initiative that it's providing financial support for various countries in their own infrastructure development across the widest definition of what infrastructure might be. But let me make a prediction. I may be proven to be wrong, but my understanding is that the Biden administration and a number of other Western countries may well seek to enhance the balance sheet of the World Bank to provide all countries with a range of development choices, choices either from the Belt and Road Initiative and China's soft finance, or through an enhanced lending program from the bank itself. So in many respects, the role of institutions like UNDP in assisting national governments across Asia to identify frankly, the optimum choices for them across their critical challenges in areas such as sanitation water, in areas such as primary health infrastructure, in areas such as universal primary and lower secondary education, as well as the rollout of baseline digital infrastructure of the type which was referred to before by Achim in India, but elsewhere as well. That the advisory to be provided by UNDP and agencies such like it to national governments about where to source finance and which models to follow in particular national circumstances, I actually think has a new premium attached to it. So I do not see this as it were, a negative period of, as it were, a retreat on the part of multilateral institutions. Quite the reverse.
Thank you, Kevin. Achim, do you want to comment on that before I head to, I'm going to head to Afghanistan. Abdullah, our UNDP rep in Kabul.
Thank you very much, Kanni, Achim, Mr. Rudd. Great pleasure to be here today. The withdrawal of the US troops is now confirmed. By 11 September, everyone will be out. In fact, the news is that they will be out even way before that, there is a sense of uncertainty across the Afghan society and also across the government and the civil service. And that sense of uncertainty is making it very difficult to deal with the challenges that come associated with such transitional phases. My question is, what type of signals UNDP, the UN, and the international community can offer Afghanistan in those next 6 critical months that we can work together towards a future narrative, a more inclusive, sustainable, prosperous narrative that takes the whole balance of power in the country towards peace rather than relapsing to conflict. As the situation today, the political economy today, if left untouched, would take us back to conflict. So what are those critical signals for the short term that can usher a better phase, more prosperous phase in the near future? Back to you.
Back to you, Kevin.
Yeah, it's a very important question given the future of the good people of Afghanistan who have suffered so much over so many decades, to be quite honest, at least in one form or another for the last 40 years. And so our hearts go out to the people with whom you work every day. I'd make 2 sets of remarks in response to your question. On, let's call it the security challenges which will arise in the period subsequent to withdrawal of all US forces and the future posture which will be adopted by the Taliban within the country. I believe it is fundamental for the UN Security Council to take a new mandate to not just monitor closely what unfolds on the ground in Afghanistan, but also to consider fresh mandates from the Council should any negative developments begin to emerge. The international community, I believe, will have no tolerance for the re-emergence of large-scale systemic violence within Afghanistan. And if the United Nations Security Council thinks that this is all too difficult and all too hard, the costs which will be associated to the world at large from a further implosion within Afghanistan itself would be far greater than the costs associated with a recommitment under a UN Security Council resolution of international forces to support the democratically elected government in Kabul. So my point is the UN Security Council needs to remain, to use the classic term of UN diplomacy, fully seized of the matter. Otherwise, we'll live to regret it, not just in terms of what happens to the people within Afghanistan, but then inevitably, as we've seen in so many phases in history in the recent past, a massive outflow of people from Afghanistan to other parts of the world. That's the first point. And the second is in terms of the economic trajectory of the country. I've visited Afghanistan many times over the years in different capacities. I've been in Kabul, I've been outside of Kabul, I've been to the north, I've been to the south, I've been in Kandahar, I've been to Orizgan, and I know the country somewhat. I can't say I'm an expert, I'm a sinologist. I'm not a specialist student of the country, but I've been there enough and know enough people from the government and from society and from the economy to have some feel for the challenges which lie ahead. What I would do in the case of UNDP is to issue a clarion clear call through the good offices of the Secretary General of the United Nations to ensure that all economic partner countries of Afghanistan remain totally in harness with the full breadth and depth of their previous development assistance frameworks for the country across the board. And in the areas that I spoke about before, sanitation, water, primary health care, universal education, the rollout of digital infrastructure, etc. And again, the role for UNDP is to maximize the coordination of that delivery on the ground. I think they're the 2 key things that can be done in what will be a challenging, but not necessarily a destructive period ahead. I believe we cannot simply assume the worst. That will be unproductive. We should assume a more moderate future, a challenging future for Afghanistan, but one which will become navigable if both the UNSC and the economic agencies and bilateral development partners remain fully engaged.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Kevin. And now I'm going to turn to Achim with a question from UNDP Vietnam. Caitlin, our rep there.
Thank you, Kanni. Honorable Kevin Rudd, Achim Steiner, thank you for the exciting, insightful discussion on issues shaping the region. And a question for you. As we know, access to the internet and technology is critical for an efficient socioeconomic recovery from the pandemic, as well as a transition to the digital economy, which has been accelerated by COVID-19. What measures and policies do you see as fundamental to bridging the digital divide, for helping vulnerable populations connect and not be left behind? Thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Good to see you. And thank you for raising an aspect of what happens next that I think is as profoundly transformative as perhaps some other great technological revolutions. And one thing that COVID, first of all, has done, I think it has brought forward by 5, in some instances, I would say even a decade, the kind of decisions that now are being made or need to be made in terms of investing in that digital economy that will touch on virtually every aspect of our societies. And I think if there's one thing that we learned over the last 12 to 14 months is that we all underestimated, first of all, how significant an opportunity digital would provide, but also how expensive and how painful it would be to not recognize that reality. The over 1 billion children that were not able to attend school, and then many hundreds of millions of them actually still being locked out of education because there is no access to broadband, to internet. Because let us remember, roughly 50% of the world's population still has no access to broadband. And so on the one hand, we are witnessing a technological revolution that is not only at the peak of the pyramid in terms of wealthier countries, wealthier parts of society being able to invest in. This can transform the lives of the poorest amongst us. Access to the financial system. Billions of people were unable to interact with our formal financial system. You could not open an account if you did not have collateral, you didn't have a passport. And then we saw the advent of digital finance and of the platforms such as M-Pesa and many others across the world. And suddenly people could actually interact in the financial system, even though there were minuscule operators. So that access, particularly for women also, to be able to, for instance, borrow money as you can now do in Kenya in the morning, to buy goods at the wholesale, take them to the market, sell them, repay your loan in the evening, or essentially at zero cost of transaction on your smartphone. These are revolutions, and we saw them also happening in the middle of COVID, when in Uganda, for example, we teamed up with some private sector companies to address the fact that market traders could not reach their customers anymore. So the equivalent of a kind of Uber trading platform was set up in a matter of weeks, and thousands subscribed to it, allowing traders to sell their vegetables to customers despite the COVID lockdown conditions. And many of you are familiar with these examples. So let me quickly get to the point of what will have to happen. Well, the first thing is quite clearly, this is a unique moment of investing in universal access to broadband and the internet. If we don't seize this moment, we are probably going to commit an error that we will regret for decades to come, because it will amplify inequality in ways that are perhaps unimaginable to some today, and something that the 2019 Human Development Report foreshadowed when it identified digital and climate as potentially the greatest variables in either increasing or decreasing inequality. Secondly, it's not just about connectivity. It's not just about hardware and infrastructure. It's building digital ecosystems. The Secretary General's Digital Cooperation Panel provided a very interesting framework to think about digital in the larger societal context. Governments need to regulate this space. And there was a wonderful phrase in that report that Melinda Gates and Jack Ma were the co-chairs of, which said, we have built over 50, 60, 70 years a normative framework of human rights, citizens' rights, legislative, regulatory frameworks to protect citizens. What is it that makes people think that what is right in the analog world ceases to be relevant in the digital world? because people say, oh, don't mess with the internet. We clearly know that digitalization brings many risks with it, including on data privacy, on cybercrime. These are real dangers, and one of the things that UNDP, by 2 years ago, taking on the digital frontier of development very much as both something in its own right, but also as a development offer to countries, is to assist countries build a digital ecosystem within which governance plays a very significant role. Now, what we need right now, however, is for the international community to do the opposite of what some countries have begun to do, and the risks are very significant, namely public financing, concessional financing, ODA, is already being cut by some countries. And yet, out of this crisis, we are all pleading with a build forward better, build back better paradigm. We have to, particularly when it comes to this kind of public good infrastructure, to realize that this is an investment in collective capacity development and ultimately a less risky development future. So connecting, for instance, 500 million school kids by making sure that all schools 5 years from now across the globe have internet connectivity, perfectly doable, perfectly financeable with public and private finance, but it needs leadership, it needs commitment. The same applies by extension to, energy. We still have close to 1 billion people without access to electricity. This is a moment where we could close that gap, accelerate the transition to renewable energy, use digital technology in the pay-as-you-go systems that allows poor people not to have to own the infrastructure, but to pay for the service as they go. These are the frontiers of development, and coming out of COVID-19, I believe they are going to be the ones that will define whether this is a period of decade-long setback or perhaps a pivot point where 10 years down the line we will say it was a terrible moment, but it also allowed us to address things that were long overdue, were perfectly doable, but we just didn't see them, we didn't seize them as an opportunity. And to me, digital really is, probably alongside the energy transition, the most important element of understanding how technology, not just as technology, but as an enabler of many possibilities, well-governed, well-regulated, could actually transform the future of development in the coming years. Back to you, Kanni, and thanks.
Thank you, Achim. I'm going to check with our ambassadors, Ambassador Peiris, Ambassador Prasad, Ambassador Ramanchi, any of the others, if you would like to put a question or a comment, feedback. Ambassador Peiris. You're muted, sir.
I'm sorry about that. I'm here. Kanni, thank you very much for giving me the floor for just 2 or 3 minutes. I must say it was balm to my ears to listen to our 2 very eminent speakers, I think who really hit the nail on the head. I was pleased to hear for once that the appropriation of global finance in the right places. Achim actually made the point that $2.4 trillion was spent on, shall we say, maintaining military hardware in Afghanistan. If that was applied in the appropriate places, perhaps in the development of that country, I think we could have turned Afghanistan into something completely different. Now, the message here, would you agree that that should be perhaps the policy? Instead, can we say that in a louder voice in the United Nations? Because we are passing resolutions every day on Syria, on Myanmar. Aren't we catching the disease very late in the day? Shouldn't we be doing it up front, apply public global finances when these countries need it, whether it be Sri Lanka, whether it be India, Myanmar, or Syria? So the point, I think, I would plead that this message that Achim and the Honorable Kevin Rudd gave us today, that we should be applying those. The Honorable Kevin Rudd said the World Bank should be given more money. For what? For infrastructure development. Perhaps if these monies, which are probably sometimes spent on other things like investigating countries, are used for development purposes, would you agree that we'll be better places? You will probably help us to get out of our problems much faster than really put us on the mat and start investigating us. So I would ask the panel as to what their response would be to the observation that I make, that global finances today must be used for infrastructure development rather than for purposes of controlling these small countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Pearce. And Ambassador Pearce is the Sri Lankan ambassador to the UN. Maybe Kevin, over to you if you have a comment on that.
What the ambassador's question goes to is the availability of global public finance. This dovetails with remarks, of course, which I made before about the World Bank and as well as, of course, the regional development banks, such as the Asian Development Bank. But to build on comments made earlier by Achim as well, the availability of finance beyond global public finance, and then beyond the national budgets of national governments, looking at national capital markets within countries. The truth is, blended finance for infrastructure development is the only real possibility for the long-term future, given the scale of the demand, which we know exists if we were to remain on track for the realization of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that we agreed on in 2015 to be realized under Agenda 2030. There is no way in which ODA will deliver that. There is some way that it could be delivered off the back of global public finance, particularly if the balance sheets of the World Bank and the regional development banks was radically expanded, and there's a way to do that. But thirdly, in harness with national capital markets, national private capital markets, and local capital markets as well. Let me give you one small example. Many countries in our region still are lagging way behind the objectives we set for ourselves under Sustainable Development Goal number 6, which is sanitation, water for all. For the last 5 years, I've been chair of Sanitation, Water for All, the peak body, if you like, created within the UNICEF framework to bring together global governmental and non-governmental actions to bring about universal access to water and quality sanitation services. One of the things that we did, Ambassador, in our work, and before I concluded my 5-year term there, was to develop a finance minister's handbook on the very pragmatic and practical questions of, I have 5 sanitation water projects to finance within my country. What are the 15 finance models that I could apply to the financing of each of them, ranging from large-scale projects involving a World Bank loan down to a very local sanitation project across 10 local villages, and how can that be done through cooperative financing at a local level. It is that sort of pragmatism in the deployment of, let's call it, the public and private financial dollar that is now essential in order to give effect to the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly in underperforming goals like SDG 6. And to conclude my answer to the ambassador's question, it is entirely conceivable that if you expanded radically the balance sheet of the World Bank, given the enormous expertise which lies within the bank and its family on project evaluation, that you could fund almost on a revolving door basis, Achim, the sort of digital infrastructure projects that you were referring to before across the developing world, across developing countries and emerging markets. And the reason is simply this: once you roll out digital infrastructures such as fiber optic cable or technology substitutes for that in particularly remote areas, then what happens over a relatively short period of time is the network begins to generate its own revenue, its own income, and your ability therefore to service a World Bank or an Asian Development Bank loan over time becomes much greater. So the opportunity for revolving door finance in this critical area of digital infrastructure, I think, is real. And certainly I'm most familiar with it in my own country. When as Prime Minister back in 2008, I embarked on a 12-year plan to roll out a national broadband network for a continent as vast as Australia, albeit only with a population of 25 million people, which in microcosm represents some of the development challenges experienced across the world, where you often have vast areas with thin populations in regional and rural areas, where the natural market provision of digital infrastructure services would not normally occur because it's outside of urban areas. I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm going to head to our ambassador from Iran. Ambassador Ravanchi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kanni, for organizing this very important and very insightful meeting. I'm really enjoying the discussions. Since we are pressed by time, very short question. How do you see the possibility of more regional cooperation in terms of providing development assistance, providing developmental projects to countries like Afghanistan, for instance, in Asia? Looking at the problems from a regional angle, in my opinion, is also important to be considered. So whether the UNDP or World Bank can work with regional countries to promote regionalism towards attacking, the problems of countries who are in need of assistance. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to actually take two more questions. I see Ambassador Tebi from Vanuatu and Ambassador Prasad from Fiji. If I can take those two and then put all three back to both Kevin and Achim. Ambassador Tebi, over to you.
Thank you, Kanni, and also thank you for the speakers for the insightful comments that they have made. These are very helpful and useful discussions. I think what Kevin Rudd has mentioned about the geopolitics, I think in the Pacific we have felt this. There's a lot of players circling around the Pacific, and for small countries, this is a challenge. As you know, we are small populations, but we also have development challenges, basic development challenges like infrastructure, addressing the digital divide, building our human resources, and we need finance, and we need international cooperation or regional cooperation to address some of these challenges. Now, my question is, in the face of these challenges, especially the geopolitical challenges, how can multilateral institutions like the UN respond to our challenges, which are really basic in nature? Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Maybe let me head to Ambassador Prasad, and then I'm going to head back to the panelists from Fiji.
Thank you very much, Kanni, and thank you very much, Mr. Rudd and Achim, for a wonderful discussion. And there's a slightly different take on my dear friend, Ambassador Odo, if I can present it. I think for many countries, we have to make the geopolitical competition boring. There's nothing in history, rising powers compete with each other, and that's been constant in histories. So somehow we have to make this very routine and boring to maximize on its development outcomes. And a question perhaps to Achim, but also to Mr. Rudd in a similar manner. How is it that we can use multilateral platforms better, such as UNDP, which brings in a cohesive way the positive inputs from both these sets of countries or many countries together for development outcomes? So China's a great infrastructure construction capacity, for example, and the soft and the concessional financing that is available in the US, brought together through UNDP type of platforms to achieve and catalyze, substantial improvements in development outcomes in Pacific Island states. And what is there a much more transformative role that UNDP type of multilateral organizations can play in this space rather than either or context? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Prasad. Let me first head to Achim in this round.
Thank you, Kanni, and thank you, ambassadors, for your answers and questions or points that you just made. And I perhaps begin with Ambassador Satyendra's point at the end, because to some extent, Kevin Rudd alluded to it already in his opening statement. The role of UNDP is not to become a protagonist on one side or the other of that geopolitical competition. It is to be the best, the trusted and legitimate advisor to a country that is looking at all its partnership options. And I think we have clearly entered a period in which, we're still trying to see, is it going to be an adversarial relationship? Well, the rhetoric certainly points to some elements, but President Biden recently used a term that to me is one we should reflect on, which is a competition. If it is viewed as a competition, then it puts really the countries that you just spoke to, Ambassador Prasad, in a better position, because in a competition, you're not forced to pick sides. You are able to pick the best option. Now, I don't want to be naive. There is a lot tied to this, but I think if we can channel this moment in time, particularly between the G2 and its impact on development investments, development finance, development partnerships, in a way where a country may choose to work with China as part of the Belt and Road, but China also acknowledges that the Belt and Road is not simply an extension of a domestic international agenda of partnership, but it also becomes best practice in terms of how development partnerships should look at issues of transparency, sustainability, and other elements, things that we have developed over many years as standards for what is a good development project, a good development investment, a good development partnership. Then I think UNDP truly has a very important role, and we have tried to navigate this with a degree of insistence over the last few years, because clearly the geopolitics is also impacting on us. And I have always argued that UNDP's role is to be a partner to a country that will look to the US, to Europe, to Japan, to China in terms of potential partnerships, and to advise that country what is in its genuine best interest. And then it is a sovereign decision to engage. I think at the same time, we need to move the thinking about development cooperation forward. We are still stuck in a development aid paradigm that ultimately is not only an anachronism, it is beginning to have perverse side effects. And that is where I think the financing for development issue is so central right now. It begins with the national government. I mean, there are three ways in which governments can essentially, mobilize development finance: taxation, borrowing, or licensing. For instance, 3G licenses, 4G licenses, 5G licenses. I mean, these are ways in which one can generate capital, first of all, from a public budget point of view. But the true variable is going to be the multiplier effect. And so the financial markets, the ability of governments to frame development investment, not just a climate, but really a regulatory framework and a development platform, I think will ultimately determine whether the mobilization of capital in quantities that we know is going to be essential will allow societies to leverage private sector capital and financial markets in support of development. So this is one reason why UNDP has spent the last 2 years working with many partners in the finance sector in developing these SDG impact norms and standards for how you would raise a bond that is called an SDG bond. We've seen Mexico do it. We've seen recently the new development bank use these new standards. We are working with the SG's Global Investors for Sustainable Development group in trying to provide the financial markets, but also governments with a tool that allows that interest in financial markets to actually invest in sustainable development and sustainable development goal aligned opportunities, physical infrastructure and social infrastructure. And I end with this. I think part of what we also heard in one of the comments earlier on, is that if we rely too much on the securitization and essentially a defense perspective on development risks and crises, the cost of trying to sustain these kinds of operations, be it in Afghanistan, be it in Iraq, in Libya, in the Sahel, are prohibitive, and they have a true opportunity cost. Imagine if we were able to channel the equivalent of what we have spent through a defense budget in these theaters, as you refer to them, Kevin, what the consequence would be. And I end by just making another point that UNDP has been testing in this COVID crisis. Temporary basic incomes, whether financed domestically by government or financed through debt suspension as a co-financing approach, ultimately universal basic incomes. These are issues that belong onto the radar of the future of development thinking, because they will address some of these contradictions that we have seen. And I go back to countries such as Haiti or Afghanistan, for that matter, where decade-long investments have not yielded the kind of breakthroughs we are looking for. And recently, our colleague, Kanni will know this, our regional director for Africa came back, and I won't mention the country right now, but an African country with a population of 1 million people, still challenged by fundamental development constraints, and asked the question, how can this be when we've been there with 17, 18 UN entities and many bilaterals for 30 years in a country with 1 million people? Something is not right about the way that development investments, development cooperation, development aid has tried to solve these problems. And I think that's precisely where I think UNDP is one of the, let's say, platforms on which the world can truly rethink its way of engaging with one another in this era of the universal goals. Kanni, back to you.
Thanks, Achim. So, Mr. Rudd, I'm going to put it to your last thoughts on picking up Ambassador Ravanchi's point on, and Ambassador Odo as well, on the need for a different kind of regional cooperation. Some could call it regional integration, that also has implications globally, because I know you've also given this a lot of thought. Over to you.
Yeah, in terms of the questions raised by the ambassadors, these go to Achim's core question of financing for development. Given the reality, as Achim and the rest of us know, that ODA globally stalled at about $140 billion some years ago, and is heading south rather than north. And financing for development, by necessity, takes us into an entirely new paradigm in terms of the three sources of funds which he referred to: national budgets, borrowing, either through the global public development banks or through other financial institutions, or three, one form of licensing or another of particular rights within countries. And multilateral development institutions such as UNDP need to be at the forefront, together with the World Bank, of pushing that agenda forward. Because the bottom line is, when we talk about financing for development, it's a phrase which rolls so easily off our lips these days. But let me put it in these terms. Without financing, there is no development. Without financing, there is zero development. And so we can have as many development seminars as we like around the world, but in the absence of a financing vehicle, frankly, it's thin air. Now, when I reflect on the challenges of my dear friends and colleagues in the Pacific Island countries, we've had our friends from Vila and Suva, from Vanuatu and Fiji speak with us just now. But across the 13 island member states of the Pacific Island Forum, which I'm deeply familiar with from my time as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia. Again, the challenges are real, but the opportunities are great in this era, if you like, of great power strategic competition. Number one is that finance options are becoming available from multiple sources. Number two, the ability to be able to draw on the expertise of UNDP and the World Bank as both UN and Bretton Woods agencies to work with national governments, whether it's the government of Fiji, the government of Vanuatu, the government of the Solomons, the government of Kiribati, Tuvalu, and the rest, on what's the best formula to adopt around a particular development project. And frankly, there is great leadership potential to be provided both by the bank and UNDP together to be in the chancelleries of the 13 Pacific Island countries in frank and open discourse and saying, friends, colleagues, if it was us, we would recommend the following in terms of the best way forward on a sanitation water project, on a digital connectivity project, on a primary education project, on a universal healthcare project, and to get it done within a reasonable time frame as well. I think there is therefore a great opportunity for the UN agencies to step up and to turn to partner governments, whether it's in Australia, whether it's in Japan, or whether it's elsewhere in the world, to ensure that our local sovereign decisions are taken and then fully supported by the institutions in making that bridge to accessible financing for development. So I'd say to our friends in the Pacific Island countries, take heart from the current circumstances, lean heavily into the UN agencies and secure the best deals possible for what you want to do, because I believe it is now probably more doable than in the past. And perhaps that is ironic, given the challenges we now face in this COVID world. Back to you, Kanni.
Thank you so much. And we've gone 15 minutes over. So let me, I know there are a few more people who've got their hands raised, but I do think we have to close this now. First, let me very much appreciate the very easy, open conversation that both our panelists, Achim and the Honorable Kevin Rudd, have engaged in. They take very complex issues and speak with such ease, including navigating all of the kind of geopolitical terrain that we are engaged with every day. And thank you very much to our ambassadors and also to our colleagues who raised questions and a number of ideas and issues that have come from this. I think this issue of the wins and losses based on financing shifts and also the state of capacity and international and regional cooperation. At the end of the day, to look at collectively, to look at the improved human condition and human dignity in our countries is at the heart of where we want to take this. So again, thank you very much to all of you. I apologize to those who I couldn't get to, but let me again thank Honorable Kevin Rudd and Achim Steiner for this opportunity to engage with you, and for all our reps and our ambassadors and colleagues who've joined us from the region and elsewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanni. Thank you, Kevin.
Good to be with you. Thank you, Achim. Thank you, Kanni. All the best.